Today we will talk about the discontinuous variation. What this discontinuous variation means. Discontinuous variation shows few clear-cut phenotypes or discrete phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. That means, as we know that in case of continuous variation, in contrast to continuous variation, there are few discrete phenotypes of a particular trait in a population, while as in case of continuous variation we see a range of phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. So in discontinuous variation, a few discrete phenotypes of a particular trait exist in population or present in population. So we know that if we have got a population, this discontinuous variation, it would be exhibited by some individuals and maybe it is not present in other individuals. So we can say that there are few discrete phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. What I mean to say is that there are no intermediate categories or intermediate states in case of discontinuous variation. So in discontinuous variation, no intermediate states. That means the individual have either this phenotype or the phenotype is absent. There are no intermediate states or intermediate categories in discontinuous variation. For example, if we take an we can take an example of gender. An individual can either be male or female. An individual can either be male or female. So gender, what we call a sex, it is an example of discontinuous variation. So the graph would be like this. If we take this character, this is character, gender, and this is number of individuals. So individual can either be, it can be either male or it can be female. So this is male, this is female. So this gender, it is an example of discontinuous variation. An individual can either be male or female. Same is the case in case of blood group. Blood group, it is also an example of discontinuous variation. For example, an individual can either have A, B or O blood group. So there are no intermediate states, there are no intermediate categories. An individual can have either A blood group or it does not have A blood group. So we can say that the phenotype is exhibited by the individual or it is not exhibited by the individual. This is in case of discontinuous variation. This blood group, we have character, that is blood group, and this is number of individuals, and we'll represent this in the form of bar graph. We'll have some individuals would have A blood group, this AB and O. These are example blood groups. So in blood group system, an individual can either have A blood group, B blood group, AB blood group or O blood group. There are no intermediate states, there are no intermediate categories in case of discontinuous variation. Same is the case We have other examples of discontinuous variation. For example, we have this antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance. For example, we have bacteria in a petri dish. We have bacteria in a petri dish. Bacteria in a petri dish. For example, there are 20 bacteria in a petri dish. Maybe 5 bacteria, they may have antibiotic resistance, while as other do not have this character, do not have this phenotype. So we can say that this antibiotic resistance is a discontinuous variation. Same is the case with the, we have, for example, in case of discontinuous variation, other examples like we have eye color. Eye color is also an example of discontinuous variation. We have tongue rolling ability. This is an example of discontinuous variation. Ability to roll tongue. Either an individual can roll its tongue or it does not roll its tongue. So it is an example of discontinuous variation. Same is the case fingerprints. This is an example of discontinuous variation. Same is the case, we have hornless cattle. And we have example of piebaldism. What this piebaldism is, it is simply the absence of melanocytes. It is characterized by the absence of melanocytes in the skin and hair of the person. As a result of that, there are white patches in skin and hair. This is called as piebaldism. Piebaldism is characterized by the absence of melanocytes in the skin, hair and eyes, and this results in the white patches in the skin and hair. Actually, it is caused by the mutation in certain genes which are responsible for the melanin production. The melanin, it is a pigment which is responsible for the normal color of the skin and hair. If this melanin is absent, then the color will be lighter. It will be white as compared to that of the normal color. So the people with piebaldism, that is, they have got a white patches, they are highly susceptible to sunburns and skin cancer. This piebaldism is also an example of discontinuous variation. Other characteristics, other important features of the discontinuous variation are this discontinuous variation. It is controlled by this discontinuous variation. This is discontinuous variation. It is controlled by one gene. It is controlled by single gene. That is, it is single gene. That is, it is monogenic. As compared to that, we have continuous variation. It is controlled by many genes. That is polygenic. This discontinuous variation, it is controlled by single gene, monogenic or few genes. This discontinuous variation, it is not having any impact of the environment, unaffected, no environmental impact, influence. It is not influenced by the environment. It is not influenced by the environment as compared to that of the continuous variation. Continuous variation is strongly influenced by the environment, while as discontinuous variation, it is not influenced by the environment. Another important feature associated with the discontinuous variation is that this discontinuous variation, it is typical of qualitative traits. It is typical of qualitative traits. Whereas continuous variation variation, it is associated with continuous variation is associated with quantitative traits. Quantitative traits are those which are countable, which are measurable traits. For example, height, for example, weight, these are quantitative traits. So this discontinuous variation, it is a typical of qualitative traits. For example, skin, for example, this blood group in humans, antibiotic resistance, these are qualitative traits. Eye color, tongue rolling ability, fingerprints, these are qualitative traits. Then another important feature is these genetic disorders. Genetic disorders, for example, sickle cell anemia, sickle cell anemia, we have albinism and color blindness. The sickle cell anemia, color blindness, albinism, genetic disorders, these are all genetic disorders. These genetic disorders, they are examples of the discontinuous variation. They are discontinuous variation. An individual can either have sickle cell anemia or it does not have sickle cell anemia. There are no intermediate categories. So this is an example of, these are also discontinuous variation. These come under discontinuous. For example, we have a population of 100 individuals. For example, in that population, one individual is having albinism. That means in other individuals the albinism is absent. So we can say that in discontinuous variation, this phenotype is shown by it is a few or discrete phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. That means this discontinuous variation, in discontinuous variation we have few discrete phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. The genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia, albinism, color blindness, they are examples of discontinuous variation. Then we have this discontinuous variation. It arises suddenly and rarely in a population. So we can say that it is also called as this discontinuous variation. It arises suddenly and rarely in a population, so it is called as mutation. It is also called as mutation or saltation. This discontinuous variation, it arises suddenly and rarely in a population, so it is also called as mutation or saltation or sports. The variation which is caused by the mutation. The variation which is caused by the mutation is also an example of discontinuous variation. So we have got this the variation which is caused by the mutation is also example of discontinuous variation. This discontinuous variation, it forms basis of mutation theory of evolution proposed by Hugo de Vries in 1901. His mutation, it forms the base of mutation theory of evolution proposed by Hugo de Vries. It forms the base of mutation theory of evolution proposed by Hugo de Vries in 1902. In 1902. What are the various causes of discontinuous variation? Causes of discontinuous variation. We have structural aberrations in the chromosomes, or numerical aberrations in the chromosomes, or gene mutation. These are the main causes of discontinuous variation. For example, structural changes in chromosomes. For example, deletion, duplication, inversion, translocation. These are structural changes in chromosomes. Or we have numerical changes in chromosomes, and this occurs through aneuploidy and polyploidy. Addition of chromosome by means of polyploidy and loss of chromosome, that is aneuploidy and polyploidy. The structural changes in chromosomes or chromosomal aberrations occur due to deletion, due to duplication, inversion, or translocation. Same is the case we have got gene mutation. Gene mutation is simply the change in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. So gene mutation is simply the change in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. It can occur by means of addition of nitrogenous bases, deletion of nitrogenous bases, or substitution of nitrogenous bases. These are some of the important causes of discontinuous variation. So we discussed what the discontinuous variation is. In discontinuous variation, we have few discrete phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. We have few discrete, or what we call as clear-cut phenotypes of a particular trait in a population. Then gender is an example of discontinuous variation. Blood group, it is an example. Antibiotic resistance is an example of there are no intermediate states in the discontinuous variation. It is controlled by single gene, monogenic. It is typical of qualitative traits. And then genetic disorders, these variations, they are also the examples of discontinuous variation. Then cause of discontinuous variation. Then there is another, what is called as substantive variation and meristic variation. So this was today's lecture. Thanks.